The Spark by Shedcrawler. Part 1 of Growing Up Quirkless and the Problems That Come With. Read by Maddie Shea. Summary. Aizawa knew that Midoriya had just as much mistrust in him as he did heart and intelligence. So that's why when Problem Child comes to him with a problem, he drops everything to make sure that it's handled properly. Shota remembers very clearly the first time that Izuku Midoriya went to him with a problem. It was much later than it should have been. If Shota had been paying attention like he should have, he would have recognized much sooner that the boy didn't trust him. Had probably never trusted him to begin with. But with the events of that school year, the USJ, the League, the possible traitor, multiple villain attacks that were all aimed towards Shota's kids, it had slipped through the cracks. He should have been more attentive, noticing much sooner that his problem child would sooner open a vein than trust adults to handle problems for him. He should have asked himself sooner why. He should have done something to amend that. But he didn't, and here he was now, sitting at his desk, staring at his problem child, who was curled into himself with his head ducked and eyes blank, looking far too scared for a student who had come to a teacher with nothing but a request for a meeting to ask for advice with a problem they were having. Shota studied Midoriya for a few seconds, taking in the tilt of his chin that hit his throat, the way his arms were curved in a way that would protect his stomach and ribs, the way his head was angled so that any attacks wouldn't make direct contact with his face. Was this body language intentional? No, Shota realized with a sense of dread. He had seen this before, whenever he or another teacher asked Midoriya to stay behind after class, or asked him a question directly. This was learnt behavior. Shota had only ever seen this type of body language from Midoriya when teachers were involved. Why? Of course, Midoriya, Shota said, standing up and nodding towards the door. The rest of the kids had already filed out of the classroom, all except for Todoroki, who was waiting at the door. He was watching Shota with an expression that Shota couldn't pin down. Nervousness, wariness, reluctant hope. But Shota didn't have the time to study the expression properly before Todoroki was giving Midoriya a small nod and turning to follow the others towards the dorms. We can talk in my office. He walked out of the classroom, Midoriya right on his heels. From the corner of his eye, he could see his student gripping the straps of his backpack tightly, the mangled fingers of his right hand tapping against the strap nervously. What was making him so nervous? The walk from the classroom to Shota's office was a quiet one, the only sounds being the footsteps and the tap-tap-tapping of Midoriya's fingers against his backpack. Shota took the few minutes to piece his thoughts together. This was important. This was very important. Since he had gotten to know Izuku Midoriya, he had known that getting the kid to ask for help, and from adults especially, was like pulling teeth. The kid trusted few, and out of the few he did trust, not one was an adult. Midoriya reaching out to an adult for help, that was big. This was something that Shota needed to do correctly and carefully, or else there was a risk of Midoriya closing himself off even tighter than before. This needed to be handled with all of the delicacy that Shota usually reserved for scared kids, animals, and hostages. Midoriya was firmly in the first camp at the moment. Shota needed to be careful and move at Midoriya's pace. He opened the door to his office, ushering Midoriya in before closing the door behind him. The kid had never been in his office before, so Shota wasn't surprised by how Midoriya shifted nervously, not sure where exactly to go. Shota led him over to the couch that he kept in his office for emergency naps and nodded for the kid to sit while he grabbed the old, ugly love seat that Hazashi had got him years ago and pulled it closer to the couch. He sat down and took a second to study the kid curled up on his couch, hunched over and picking at his nails. The blank look in his eyes hadn't faded. Shota watched him for a few seconds before deciding that his usual style of letting kids come to him wouldn't work here. Midoriya needed a nudge. So what can I help you with, Midoriya? Midoriya jerked slightly at his name, glancing up from behind his curly hair shyly before looking back down at the ground. There was a pause before Midoriya asked in a small, shaky voice, What do I have to do to make sure that someone doesn't make it onto campus? Shota narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Of all the things he had thought his problem child would say, that wasn't it, but it was important, and a little concerning that his problem child was so afraid of someone that he came to a teacher with a specific purpose of keeping them off campus altogether. A specific someone? Midoriya chewed on his cheek, eyes flicking up at his teacher as if he was looking for something. Shota could only guess he must have found it before Midoriya shifted slightly, pulling his backpack off and opening it. Pulling out a thick envelope that Shota remembered delivering to him just a few days ago. After it had made its way through UA's thorough screening process, the envelope was torn at the top and wrinkled with little indents pressed into it, like Midoriya had been gripping it tightly at one point. "I got a letter from an old classmate," Midoriya said softly, eyes stuck firmly on the envelope. I don't want to see him." He trailed off, but Shota heard the message hidden behind those words. "Please keep him from me, Sensei." "May I read the letter?" Shota asked calmly before tilting his head towards the envelope. He quickly added, "You don't have to say yes. Either way, I'll make sure that you don't have to see them." Persona non grata paperwork was a pain in the ass, but a necessary one, and one that Shota would gladly take to make sure that his kids felt safe. It would help if I knew the situation, however, so I know what to expect. "Do you believe that he might show up on campus?" "Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe," Midoriya said softly, gripping the envelope tightly. He sniffled, and his eyes turned shiny for a moment before the boy firmly pursed back the tears. Shota's student took a shaky breath before looking up at Shota with an expression that reminded him of the most recent box of abandoned kittens that he had found tucked under a dumpster. Small, scared, and looking for someone to trust. Someone to help them. "Sensei," he asked shakily, "if I tell you something, you won't tell anyone, will you?" Shota narrowed his eyes as he thought of a way to answer that question. He wished the answer could be a simple no. It would make it easier to gain the kid's trust. If it was. But it wasn't, and his problem child deserved the truth. "I'll do my best not to. However, if you are going to tell me something that puts yourself or others in danger, then I will have to take action, and that might have to involve telling a few specific people. But I'll do so with keeping your privacy in my highest regard, problem child." He promised with a quiet gravity that he hoped the boy felt. "Also, I know the importance of keeping secrets." "Because you're an underground hero," Midoriya said softly, a bit of awe bleeding into expression and voice. "You'd probably have to know a lot about keeping secrets in your work, especially considering that you work in the shadows more than the limelight heroes, and your quirk depends on the initial surprise of your enemies not having access to their quirks." Shota's lips twitched up slightly, and he felt the warm flicker of pride in his chest. It was always nice to see his students show just how smart they could be, and Problem Child had intelligence in spades. "That's right," he said, tilting his head in a nod. There was a flash of hesitance over Midoriya's face before he said softly, "I used to want to be an underground hero. It was the only type of heroics I could see myself going into." Interesting. Shota wouldn't have pegged Midoriya as someone who would go into underground heroics, but the more Shota thought of it, the more sense it made. The boy was sneaky, clever, and quiet, and knew how to blend into a crowd. But it was odd, considering that with his quirk, the boy would have been pushed towards limelight heroics from an early age. "Is that so?" Shota asked, leaving the question open-ended. Midoriya nodded, twisting his hand anxiously. "Yeah, I knew that it would be the best fit for someone like me. Plus, I liked the idea of no one knowing much about me. I want to save people with a smile, like All Might," he hurried to explain, like his hero worship of the man was being called into question. "But underground heroics focus on raids, human trafficking rings, and things like that. Things that a lot of limelight heroes overwork. And I want to help everyone. And I mean, I don't like people seeing me, judging me, and that's all people did back then." Midoriya pulled at his fingers anxiously before whispering softly, "That's all they ever did as soon as they found out." Shota leaned forward, feeling like he was inches away from solving something, from things clicking into place, into a clear picture where he might be able to understand what his problem child was going through easier. He jerked his head slightly, getting a good look at Midoriya's face. The kid was afraid. What was he afraid of? "Found out what?" he asked, interjecting as much gentleness as he could into the question. It seemed like a century passed as he waited for Midoriya to answer the question, but when he did, Shota felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. "Found out I didn't have a quirk, that I was quirkless." Quirkless! There were so many things that ran through Shota's mind at that mission, but the one that he grabbed onto was, no fucking wonder the kid doesn't trust anyone. Shota had seen the statistics on quirkless people, had read up and then from the moment that UA had opened its doors to the quirkless population, it had made his stomach roll and made him remember the days of walking down his middle school halls and hearing whispers of villain hiss behind his back. And now looking at Midoriya, the statistics flashed through his mind again. Oh, problem child, you're a late bloomer, Shota's realized with a small spark of anger lighting in his gut. It was a small wonder now, but later when Shota was alone, it would turn into a raging fire. Why wasn't Shota made aware of this? Why hadn't it been in Midoriya's files? It should have been in the damn file. If Shota was right, and Problem Child had been part of the 1% of the quirked people who got their quirks when they were teenagers, then there were complications. There were reasons that quirks developed that late into life, and none of them were good. Had the kid been repressing his quirk then? If so, there was only a handful of reasons why, and trauma was right at the top of the list, or the most common reason, abuse, severe abuse. If Shota had been aware of Midoriya's status as a late bloomer, he would have started a discreet investigation to make sure the kid was safe, but it hadn't been in his file. The spark flared slightly. Shota remembered the first day of class and how he had almost expelled Problem Child, a kid with heroic potential and almost gone because Shota didn't have all of the fucking information. Putting that aside, it was dangerous for Midoriya to be going around with only the smallest understanding of his quirk. Shota knew that he wasn't in quirk counseling, something that Shota would be fixing, and that meant he was walking around with only a slim understanding of what his quirk was capable of. Midoriya was essentially a toddler, stumbling his way through learning about his quirk without anyone there to help him. Was anyone else aware of Midoriya's status as a late bloomer? Shota remembered how close All Might was to the boy and put that aside for now, too. He had a suspicion that the man knew about it and kept the information close to his chest. He'd interrogate All Might later, and if he was correct in his suspicion, rip into him later. He needed to focus on Midoriya right now, not him. Midoriya, who was shaking his head and keeping his eyes firmly on the ground. No, he whispered shakily. Quirkless, I am quirkless, Sensei. He sniffled, looking up at Shota with wide, teary eyes. I didn't get my quirk until I was 14, and it wasn't always there. It wasn't dormant. All Might gave it to me. What? It's my quirk, Midoriya continued like he hadn't just dropped a bomb into Shota's lap. It's mine now, and that means I can tell who I want. He sniffled and rubbed at his eyes weakly. All Might passed his quirk onto me just like it was passed on to him. Shota stared at him, slowly leaning back in his ugly plush chair. Pieces were clicking into place, and even though it wasn't the picture that he thought it was one that made sense nevertheless. The way that Yagi pulled Midoriya aside at times, the way Yagi obviously favored Midoriya above all the other students, the way that Yagi seemed to have a personal connection to the boy. He had a personal investment in his future because he had given Midoriya his quirk. Yagi had given a 14-year-old child a quirk that broke his bones and didn't tell anyone about it. I see, Shota said, sounding a lot calmer than he actually felt. Thank you for telling me this, Midoriya. It means a lot to me that you trusted me enough to come to me with this. Do you feel comfortable telling me more? It's okay if you don't. You're under no obligation to. You've told me plenty already. He would be speaking with Yagi later on, and the man wouldn't have the option of staying quiet like the child in front of him. But Midoriya had already been so brave to date, coming to Shota with a problem that he needed help with and being open about his quirkless status. Shota felt so proud of his problem child. He had grown so much from the start of the year, and Shota could only imagine what the boy would be like by the time it came for him to graduate. But Midoriya had done enough. Shota didn't want to push him further than he had to, but Midoriya nodded. I want to tell you, Sensei, he said softly. I probably should have told you before, but this is a big secret, and All Might warns me not to tell anyone, but I need to tell someone. I need help, he confessed with a whisper like it was shameful. Shota slowly reached out and placed a hand on Midoriya's knee, making the boy look up at him with teary eyes. I want to help you, problem child, he said gently. I'm glad that you came to me about this. Everyone needs help at times, and I'm proud that you knew when you needed to reach out for help. Midoriya smiled at him, wobbly and teary, but real, and then he told Shota a ghost story. Shota listened to every word of Midoriya's story, anger growing in his gut with every word that he said. 8 heroes before this boy, this little kid who had the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he was giving the objective of coming after All Might, the symbol of peace, who would change the way that people viewed heroics altogether. And he was meant to be the successor of the man when Midoriya wasn't even sure what type of hero he wanted to be. Shota thought of the wistful way that Midoriya talked about underground heroics and wondered if the boy was forcing himself to go in one direction rather than the one that he wanted because of who had come before him. A problem for another time. He really would have to speak to Yagi after this conversation to get his side of the story, because from what Shota was getting from Midoriya's side of the story, the boy had an absurd amount of pressure on his small shoulders and had only one person in his corner, someone who didn't really know what he was doing at all. Shota waited until Midoriya was done before asking, "Who else knows about this?" "All Might," Midoriya said softly. "Just All Might. He told me not to tell anyone else." "Yagi, you fucking idiot." Shota nodded slowly. "I see." He paused, a thought tugging at him, demanding his attention. "Midoriya, you've trusted me a lot today, and I'm grateful for that. And now I'm hoping that you'll trust me one more time because I have a question for you." Midoriya looked up at him, eyes full of tentative trust. "From the start of the year, I've been reading the relationship between you and Bakugo as that of a rivalry. The two of you pushing each other to make each other stronger. From what I've heard here today, I'm thinking that I was wrong to believe that. Did Bakugo bully you before UA, Midoriya?" He didn't need a verbal answer. The way that Midoriya looked away and curled tighter into himself spoke volumes, but Midoriya gave him one anyway. "Yes, Sensei." The boy laughed, the laugh sounding a bit like a sob. "He thought that I was looking down on him because I wanted to be a hero, even though I'm quirkless, weak, useless, a Deku." "You're not any of those things," Shota said firmly, squeezing Midoriya's knee gently. The spark of anger was glowing brightly at how Shota had missed this, but he kept his tone calm and gentle. "Quirkless people aren't weak or useless. Quirks are a tool. They might make things easier, but that's all they are, a tool. They don't make anyone worth more than any quirkless person, and I'm sorry that people have made you believe that. I will be dealing with Bakugo myself after our meeting concludes." And thinking seriously about the boy's place in the heroics department. Any person that looked down on another for something they couldn't control was someone who had potential, but it wasn't the heroic potential that Shota thought the boy had. It was the potential of another kind that Shota needed to deal with carefully. See if the boy felt any remorse for what he did, find out what exactly he had done. He'd be taking a trip to Aldera Middle School soon to do some investigating, which would most definitely end with the footage of the last 3 years being pulled, but no matter what he found, Bakugo would have to change classes, whether that meant to Class 1B or to General Education or leaving the school altogether. It depended on how Shota's investigation went, but he would not have the boy in his class. Separating the bully from the victim was standard procedure, and it was one that Shota would follow closely. Midoriya didn't need to deal with him any longer. "Please don't expel him, Sensei," Midoriya pleaded softly, staring up at Shota with those big eyes. "Please, he's gotten better." "But not towards you." Midoriya winced and nodded. "No, not towards me." Shota pulled away from Midoriya and leaned back in his chair. "Whether or not Bakugo is expelled is not up to you. It's up to him. His actions are his own, and he needs to know that there are consequences to them. If he wants to be a hero, then he can't have everything handed to him. I'll be looking into what happened before UA, and I'll make my decision based on that and a future conversation with him. But it has nothing to do with you, Problem Child. This was something that Bakugo will have to handle on his own." There was a moment of silence between the two of them for a moment as Midoriya just stared at the table and Shota studied Midoriya. The boy seemed a little lighter than he had when he had walked into the office, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "The boy who had sent the letter," Midoriya said finally, voice scratchy from holding back tears. "His name is Yagami Enji. He was one of Kachan's friends back in middle school. He has a quirk where he can make his fingers and nails grow really long. He used to Midoriya's breath hitched, but he continued on, wiping his eyes firmly. He used to trip me up sometimes with his fingers, knock my things out of my arms, scratch me during class. He liked putting red spider lilies on my desk after the news of Quirkless suicide hit. I mean, everyone did. It was just a thing, I guess. Everyone did it, but he was one who did it the most. He left me a bouquet of them once after there was news of a group of Quirkless kids going together. That was wrong of them, Shota said firmly. He took in this boy in front of him and wondered how many red spider lilies he had gotten over the years, wondered how many had tried to put a stop to it, wondered if Bakugo went along with it with the rest, and laid a flower on Midoriya's desk, and how he would justify himself to Shota if he ever had. Did your teachers ever do anything to stop them? He let out a sigh when Midoriya shook his head, not surprising considering the boy had been quirkless. There had been a quirkless girl in Shota's elementary school, only for a month. She had transferred just a month after the school year started, but Shota remembered her name clearly because the kids in her year, 2 years below Shota's, had called her Sakura the Vestigial Girl. The girl was a leftover thing from an era that people liked to pretend didn't exist. Shota had glared at anyone who used the name in his hearing and had hissed at people in her class to stop bothering her. Sakura looked at him like he had been the first one who had ever stood up for her. He probably had been. They had never spoken, but she used to sit at the empty table that he ate lunch at. No one wanted to mess with the future villain, and that meant Sakura never had to worry about being targeted at lunch. But Shota hadn't been there all the time. He hadn't been too awkward and nervous about reaching out to make friends to try with Sakura. He should have. He really should have. She had transferred when a boy a year above her had pushed her down the stairs. Shota found her, sobbing and alone with a broken leg and a boot print pressed into her face. He had rushed to grab a teacher who had just sighed when she saw Sakura, tisking and asking what she had done to herself this time. The teacher didn't believe Shota or Sakura when they told her what happened or took any notice of the boot print. Shota had gotten detention for being out of class while Sakura had been shipped off to the nearest clinic that treated quirkless people. She had never returned to that school. If Midoriya's teachers had been anything like Shota's or Sakura's, then it wasn't a surprise that he didn't trust teachers. He wants to meet with me, Midoriya continued, holding out the envelope with a shaking hand. Shota took it, placing it to the side to read later on. He said that he saw me at the sports festival and wants to meet me again. Tears leaked out of Midoriya's eyes and he whispered out a broken, he apologized, said he was sorry for teasing me when we were in middle school. Midoriya choked on a sob and he pushed his fist into his mouth and pulled it back after a moment and looked at Shota pleadingly. I don't want to see him, Sensei. He says he'll be visiting town soon with a bunch of other kids from another hero school. He's in the support course and they're coming here for a competition or something. But I don't want to see him. Please, Sensei. Shota stood up, moving forward and crouching in front of Midoriya, taking both of his hands in his own. You won't have to, he said firmly, squeezing his problem child's hands tightly. I'll make sure that he doesn't make it on campus. Yakugami Enji, another person for Shota to investigate. I'll file the paperwork today, and that'll make it so that he won't be allowed on UA property under any circumstances. I promise, problem child, you won't have to see him as long as you go to school here. He squeezed Midoriya's hands tightly again before softening his tone. Breathe with me, kid. You need to calm down. Follow me. We'll breathe together. He took in an exaggerated breath, and a spark of pride grew alongside the spark of anger at how Midoriya immediately tried to copy him. His problem child was a good kid. They stayed like that for a few minutes until Midoriya's breathing had evened out. The kid was a bit more relaxed now, his hands limp and shoulders missing the usual line of tension that ran through them. Shota gave Midoriya's hands one more squeeze before pulling back, placing his hands on his knees. There's going to be a few things that we'll have to discuss in the future, he said gently, about your quirk, for one, about life before UA, about his home life too, but Shota didn't say that. He had only met Midoriya Inko once, and while she had seemed like a kind woman, Shota knew the statistics. 95% of quirkless kids grew up in abusive or neglectful homes. It was possible that Problem Child was part of the 5% who didn't, but Shota couldn't leave that up to chance. Midoriya showed signs of an abused child, and maybe it came solely from the school system, but Shota had to check. He had to be sure. For now, Midoriya was safe in the dorm rooms. For now, and until Shota was sure nothing was happening with his mother, Class 1A would be having mandatory weekend training sessions, and that would stop any trips home. But for now, I think you need time to rest and calm down. I know that you usually have study sessions with your friends after class, but I suggest skipping this one if you're feeling like you need time alone. Midoriya wiped at his eyes and managed a weak smile. I told Todoroki that I'd be talking to you today, but I didn't give him any details, but I think he knew that it was going to be heavy. That explained the look Todoroki had given Shota before leaving the classroom. We're going to have tea in his room when I get back, and he said that he'd make Katsudon for the two of us, and that should be ready by the time I get back to the dorms. He said that he'd explained to the others that we'd be having alone time and not to bother us. He hesitated before softly saying, but firmly, I'm going to tell him too. About One for All, about being quirkless, everything. Not today, but I'm going to tell him. I trust him. Shota only nodded. Good. You need people in your corner, Problem Child. If you trust Todoroki, then there is no reason why you shouldn't tell him. He softened his voice again. After all, it's your quirk, your secret. You choose who gets to hear it. No one else. You. Midoriya shuddered at that, but his smile grew a little. Thank you, Sensei. I'm glad that I told you all of this. Where there was something like shock in the boy's voice, like he was surprised that trusting an adult, a teacher, had actually turned out in his favor for once. Shota would have to take care of his tentative trust to make sure that it blossomed into something stronger than the fragile little seedling it was right now. But it was a start. Midoriya had done all that he could by reaching out for out. It was Shota's turn to reciprocate, to prove that he was worthy of this trust. And I'm glad that you told me all of it, Shota said, his lips twisting up into a rare smile. As I said, we'll be revisiting this topic later on. I'll be speaking to All Might later today about this and your quirk, and ask him how many bones Midoriya would have to break before Yagi would have come to him and told him the truth. There are going to be a few things that I'm going to insist on. Quirk counseling and extra lessons that you'll be taking alongside a few others of your peers. Therapy as well, but Midori had been pushed through enough today, and Shota didn't want to introduce anything too new and scary to the boy until he had time to calm down more. I'll be suggesting a few things, people that would be safe to tell the secret to, and who would help you. Hizashi was right at the top of the list. As far as Shota was concerned, his husband knew what it was like to have a quirk that hurt the user's bodies, and it was a bitch and a half to learn to control. Hound Dog was another, if only to make therapy easier for everyone concerned. But ultimately, it will be up to you. I meant it when I said that you decide who knows about this and who doesn't. Thank you, Sensei, Midoriya said, wiping at the tear tracks on his cheeks weakly. Thank you. He stood up and pulled his backpack up clumsily on his shoulders. Shota stood up and helped him, causing a pink blush to crawl up his cheeks. The boy ducked and murmured out another thanks before turning to leave, but he paused, and just as he reached the door and half-turned just enough the boy could see him. Sensei, can I ask you a question before I leave? Shota tilted his head. Of course. Do you think I could have been a hero without taking the quirk? Ah. Shota's expression just softened. He thought of Midoriya's massive heart and his endless determination and his analytical mind. He answered honestly, Midoriya, even without a quirk, I'm sure you would have wormed your way into my class somehow. Maybe you wouldn't have been able to pass the entrance exams. That's not a slight against you. I didn't pass the entrance exams. He arched an eyebrow at how Midoriya turned to him fully with a shocked expression. Midoriya, What the hell could I have done against robots when I was your age? Nothing. I failed the entrance exam and fought tooth and nail to win the sports festival. It was only then I was allowed into the heroics department. It was quirkus and something I'm sure you know, and something that I and a few select others have been working to fix. But there are a multitude of ways to get into the heroics department, and the entrance exam and the sports festival are only two of them. I have no doubt in my mind that you would have found them and gone after them with everything in you. One of the ways was for a teacher to be impressed by a student and train them for a specialty made transfer exam. It was what Shota was doing with Shinzo now. He thought of meeting a quirkless boy who was willing to fight tooth and nail to get what the world was more than willing to deny him for something that he couldn't help. He thought of the way Midoriya fought for everything, that he had gotten so far with steel in his spine, and knew that he would have had two personal students if he had met Midoriya under those circumstances. So yes, Problem Child, even without taking the quirk, I think you could have been a hero. For a second, Shota thought that Midoriya was about to cry again. His lips wobbled and tears shone in his eyes, but then he smiled at Shota, the tears there, but not falling. Thank you, Sensei. I think I needed to hear that. And then he left the office, closing the door with a click behind him. Shota waited until the sound of Midoriya's shoes clicking against the floor faded away before letting out a deep breath. The entire situation was complex. Shota had many things to do now because of what his problem child had told him. Persona non grata paperwork, investigations into Yakagami Enji, Aldera Middle School, an investigation into Bakugokowski, and a look to see if the boy deserved to be in the heroics department, if he would be put in Hazashi's 1C class, general education, or if he would be kicked out altogether. He talked to All Might about Midoriya and his failure in handling the situation, an investigation into Midoriya's home life to make sure that there was no abuse going on, and more that would have to be addressed as well. But Shota was going to take a minute to breathe. Midoriya had come to him and asked for help, and trusted an adult to do something that he couldn't do himself. For now, that was enough. Hey everyone, thank you for listening. This is the first podfic I've ever recorded, so if you have any advice or recommendations, leave them in the comments. Thank you for listening.